Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Faith Forum, sponsored by the Wake Forest University School of Divinity. My name is Corey Walker. I'm Dean of the School of Divinity and the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities. And on behalf of the entire faculty and community at Wake Divinity, we want to welcome you to Faith Forum. Religion stands at the center of American public life in our contemporary moment. At a time when the very foundation and future of American democracy and democracy across the globe is intensely contested, religion functions both as a panacea and as a problem that animates some of our most intense public debates. Indeed, the tremendous challenge of the moment requires considered and critical reflection on a number of issues, including how and in what ways scholars and people of faith can and should inform and engage public life. The Wake Forest University School of Divinity continues to leverage its convening power to serve as a hub of faithful intellectual engagement with public impact. Wake Divinity not only provides an exemplary education and preparation for graduate theological students, we also engage the broader community through invited lectures, publications in leading scholarly journals, and engaging some of the most pressing critical questions of public interest. Wake Divinity's Faith Forum is our premier convening space to critically engage not only scholars and faith leaders on cutting-edge intellectual trends and pressing issues of public concerns, it is also a space to engage in deliberate and intentional conversation, where we not only hear some of the leading ideas of the day, but we're also able to model a practice of listening that opens up unto new modes of hospitality. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a first-rate theologian, a master teacher, and one of my dear colleagues, Dr. Elizabeth O'Donnell Gandolfo, where we will discuss two of her latest books, not one, but two of her latest books. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Gandolfo, and then we'll engage in a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll engage questions from the audience. Dr. Elizabeth O'Donnell Gandolfo is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Early Associate Professor of Catholic and Latino Studies at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity. She is a constructive theologian rooted in the Catholic tradition, whose teaching and research place Christian theology in conversation with human responses to vulnerability, suffering, violence, and oppression. She also places Christian theology in conversation with those issues, especially in context of social injustice and ecological degradation. Dr. Gandolfo is author and editor of a number of books, articles, and book chapters. Her first book, The Power and Vulnerability of Love, A Theological Anthropology, draws on women's diverse experiences of maternity and natality to construct a feminist theology of suffering and redemption that is anchored in the reality of human vulnerability. She is also co-editor of Parenting as Spiritual Practice and Sources for Theology, Mothering Matters, published by Palgrave in 2017. This book brings together theological reflections on mothering by an intergenerational, interracial, and intercultural group of women scholars in theology, Bible, and ethics. In recent years, Dr. Gandolfo's research has turned to decolonial studies. I'm looking forward to discussing that. As a critical dialogue partner for Christian theology. Her co-authored book, Remembering the Reign of God, the Decolonial Witness of El Salvador's Church of the Poor, places the decolonial practice of the ecclesial-based communities of El Salvador in critical conversation with the continued coloniality of Roman Catholic ecclesiology and eschatology. In her most recent book, Ecomartyrdom in the Americas, Living and Dying for Our Common Home, Dr. Gandolfo highlights the ongoing murder of land and environmental defenders, particularly in Latin America, and theologically engages their witness in light of recent developments in Catholic social thought and liberation theology. In addition to research and writing, Liz finds her fulfillment in teaching theology at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and great joy and challenge in the adventures of her other full-time job, raising 4 school-age children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Gandolfo. So Liz, that last job, the last full-time job that you have, other than the other full-time jobs, we'll talk about that later. But first, give us an overview of these 2 amazing books, Remembering the Reign of God and Ecomartyrdom in the Americas.
Sure. To really do justice to an overview, I'd have to tell you my whole life story and how these came about, but I'll do my best to be brief. The first of the 2 books, oh, you'll hold it up for me? Do the props? Okay, I'll hold it just close to my heart. The first of the 2 books, Remembering the Reign of God, and that's a remembering the Reign of God, the Decolonial Witness of El Salvador's Church of the Poor, stems from experiences I had 20 years ago in my youth, living and working in the ecclesial-based communities of El Salvador. Ecclesial-based communities are small Christian communities at the grassroots level, mostly Roman Catholic, though there are and were some Protestant communities across Latin America. But these communities grew out of the reforms in the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s and 70s. They grew out of the Second Vatican Council, and they grew out of the conferences of bishops in the 60s and 70s, which sought to empower the laity to be the church, to be the people of God, and indeed to be the church of and for and with the poor, the impoverished, those who have been economically oppressed by the history of colonialism and capitalism, particularly moving into the later 20th century neoliberal capitalism. There's this empowerment from below for lay people to take charge of what it means to be the church. And so these small communities form in the mostly the late 60s, early 70s, around biblical circles, placing in conversation Christian faith and the political and economic context of the times. And so in the early 2000s, 20 years ago now, I lived and worked with these communities in El Salvador for 2 years. And I was what was called a solidarity coordinator, and I took delegations of well-meaning folks from the United States and Canada and Australia around to visit and learn from. These weren't mission trips. They were for people coming from the global north mostly to learn from the ecclesial-based communities. I took them around and invariably the delegation would always say, what can we do? What can we do to be in solidarity with you? And their response was always invariably, go tell our story. Take this, what you've learned, and tell people in your churches, your universities, your government, please, what we have experienced. And so this book is 20 years in the making of me wanting to respond to that call myself after 2 years of living and working and communing with the communities in El Salvador. And so about 6 years ago now, I linked up with another volunteer who was with the communities for 6 years in the 2010s, if that's what we call them. 20-teens. She was there more recently and for much longer and did a master's thesis at the Jesuit University there with a lot of field work. And we just kind of put our heads together. How can we share this story and challenge Christians in the global north, especially white Christians in the global north, and how do we challenge the Catholic Church, especially both being Catholic lay women, to heed this witness of the self-proclaimed Church of the Poor in El Salvador. So that's where this book comes from. And we've divided it into two parts. Part one is it's like the Bible. It's a Salvadoran salvation history where we lay out kind of the story of the people of El Salvador as the base communities themselves tell it. And then in the second part, we engage with the tools of decolonial studies, decolonial scholarship, to critically reflect on how the witness of the base communities, of the Church of the Poor, decolonizes Catholic theology and ecclesial praxis in many different areas: tradition, authority, hierarchy, all of these things. So it's part telling the story, salvation history in El Salvador, and it's part theological reflection. So that's the first one. And the second? Ecomartyrdom. This book also grew out of my time in El Salvador, those 2 years. The base communities of El Salvador are permeated with, infused with the memory of martyrs. In the 70s and 80s, more historical martyrs as well, but in the 70s and 80s, thousands and thousands of Christians were killed for standing up for justice and seeking liberation. And so there are litanies of martyrs, including Archbishop Oscar Romero, who is now canonized in the Catholic Church. He is on, the living room or kitchen wall of every home in the base communities and graces all the chapels and sacred spaces, but many, many others, dozens and dozens of well-known martyrs who are remembered. And this is a practice of Christian formation, remembering who these individuals were and the role that they played in the Salvadoran armed conflict, and what it meant for them to stand up in the way that they did, even though they knew they could and may even most probably lose their lives, and many of them did. So this is practice of spiritual formation. So I was deeply affected by this, but naively in the early 2000s thought, well, that period of Latin American history is kind of in the past, right? But it wasn't. In my master's program, I remember hearing news of Sister Dorothy Stang, who's one of the martyrs featured in the book, that she was murdered in the Brazilian Amazon. I didn't know a whole lot more about that context or what might be happening, or the fact that there were hundreds of others being killed every year besides her. But then in 2016, I was teaching my first year at the School of Divinity. I was teaching a class on Mary, Saints, and Martyrs in Latino Catholicism. And in the middle of that class, when we were talking about martyrdom, Archbishop Romero, other martyrs of Latin America, Berta Cáceres was killed in Honduras for standing up to a mega hydroelectric dam project. And I thought, oh, something's happening here. And learned that this is a weekly occurrence around the world. There's hundreds of land and environmental defenders being killed around the world every year. And Latin America is a hot spot. There are certain places in Latin America that are really dangerous places to be land and environmental defenders. And so I looked around in the world of theology, and all the martyrs we're talking about are from the 70s and 80s. And it's a nostalgia that I think places them naively in the past and doesn't see that that is happening around the world today. And so I thought this story has to be told, and folks in theology and theological education in Christian churches, in ecological ministries need to know about the stories of the folks who are being killed today for their frontline work in these struggles. And so that's what this book is all about.
Before we engage, this really provocative idea of Martyrd and Nostalgia, I want you to give us a bit of a texture of the transition between the age of the great martyrs that we typically have, particularly in liberation theology, Oscar Romero's, the Jesuit scholars, Aya Correa, and the 5 other Jesuit scholars at UCA in El Salvador. When we think of, we've just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Chile and the killing of Salvador Allende, the military dictatorships in Brazil and also in Argentina. How do we understand the change from that mode of existence to the time when you're writing, the early 2000s, when you're seeing this? What are the, in the words of Christina Sharp, what are the afterlives of that moment, and how do they continue to reverberate and are continuing on?
Wow, that's a great question. So when I lived and worked in El Salvador, the afterlife of that was so recent. And as a young person, I didn't really realize how recent 10 years ago it really was. So the peace accords in El Salvador were from 1992. And when you're 24, 10 years is almost half your lifetime. So it felt very distant. But for the people who lived it, it was not distant. It was very much present. And so that memory of martyrdom it wasn't nostalgia, right? It was living, continuing the lived memory and resurrection of the martyrs whom they loved in their own lifetimes, or who, for young people who weren't alive when they were killed, they're members of their households or their church, their communion of saints, their cloud of witnesses, if you will. And so when we infuse Christian theology into understanding that after the afterlife of memory, it's not that they exist in the past. They are present here today and are called out. Their names are called out with a call and response of the person's name and presente. That person is present. Or que viva, long live Oscar Romero. He's still alive. And so as we look back at that time period of these intense political killings under military dictatorships, by death squads, there's a different political moment now in Latin America, but it's almost more, it's just more complicated and ambiguous because it's not as clear that the state is killing the people, but it is, It's implicated in and complicit in that killing in ways that I think we're familiar with in this country as well. But there's just a whole lot more entanglement of different forces at play, from multinational corporations to organized crime to corrupt police forces and to politicians who are on the take, to some right-wing governments who are actively encouraging this kind of incursion into people's lands and territories. And so the killing continues. It's not an afterlife of the period at all. It is still happening, just in more complicated, ambiguous, and difficult to discern kind of ways. And so people are drawing, in the communities that I talk about in this book, folks are remembering Berta Cáceres from 2016, who I talk about in this book, as one of the martyrs up there now on the wall with Oscar Romero. So the way in which the communities incorporate Romero into their life is the same way in which they're now incorporating Berta into the life and the cloud of witnesses of their community. Does that make sense?
I really like the way you're now underscoring the re-memory in the title. It is an active component of living. It is not memory that is in the past. It is memory that is trans-temporal, a memory that continues to live on and is continuing to put back together in new and dynamic ways to then attack some of the forces that are still challenging these communities. You speak of these base ecclesial communities. These aren't the communities of the legitimate, the authorized, the proper. These are the communities of the dispossessed. Mm-hmm. These are the communities of the suffering, the crucified ones, the poor. Talk to us of how they challenge the position of the church and the position of those legitimate institutions in society.
Mm-hmm. They're not afraid to do so, having been formed in that theology and spirituality of martyrdom. So, Dean Walker, you're correct. These communities, there's research in religious studies that's been done to show that the majority of the poor are actually gravitating toward Pentecostalism and evangelicalism. But there's this small but fruitful movement that's still going on of ecclesial-based communities in Latin America, of those who, from the underside of history, understand the role of the poor and oppressed, dispossessed, and the wretched of the earth as being that of, choose my words here. I don't want to say vanguard, but they're bringing about, they're harbingers of the reign of God. They are doing the work of being the people of God from below. And so they challenge the institutional, they are the church, okay? So when we talk about the church, the communities we're talking about here are the church. But as the church of the poor, or los y las pobres, in the book we actually, my co-author and I made the decision to keep that in Spanish with the LXS to be gender inclusive, pobres, because when we talk about the poor in English, it's kind of condescending and paternalistic. But los y las pobres, they have taken up agency and subjectivity. This is a decolonial aspect of their epistemology and ontology, the way they exist and act in the world, and have said, we're the ones who need to change things. We are going to enact the alternative, and are doing so. So from anything from protesting the privatization of water to protesting, metallic mining in the country, they're on the front lines of those struggles. But within the church proper, which I think is what your question is trying to get at, they're challenging a hierarchical colonial structure and culture with a radically egalitarian understanding of what the community of the church actually is, of what the people of God, who the people of God is. And so in El Salvador, this has almost been forced to have happened. Across other parts of Latin America, there's still a great deal of support by some bishops and priests and kind of the institutional church for ecclesial-based communities. In El Salvador, the base communities were driven out of the institutional church. And so they were seen as a threat to the power of the archbishop and the bishops and the priests, and we're told this is not the way that we are going to be church. And if you want to continue being church this way, our doors are locked to you. So they are a clear witness or counter witness to the hierarchical model. And that doesn't change the hierarchical model. This is like the frustration, but also the beauty of what they do is that it may not change the way the structures of the church are actually working, but it decolonizes the church nonetheless because the base communities are living and doing it every day. They're embodying that. They're embodying being the church of the poor. They're embodying that journey to the reign of God, that work that needs to be done from below.
You've mentioned a bit on, and we talked about it, I sort of said I want to talk about this decolonial move theologically. Mm-hmm. And some folks may, what are we talking about, this decolonial move? And of course, we're going to get to liberation theology next, but you bring together decolonial theory and deep conversation with not only the witness of these ecclesial-based communities, but even in the form of the text and remembering the reign of God, you have the text side by side and sort of prefacing not only the Bible, but I'm thinking of the work of sort of Richard Price and the way he has the official text over and against the text of the community. But you're also bringing together the work and thinking of such decolonial theorists, Annabelle Quijano, you've got Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres,
Sylvia
Enrique Dussel, Sylvia Winters.
I love that you quoted her in chapel yesterday.
Oh,
It's very.
you
never
can,
thought I'd heard Sylvia Winter in that.
No, you can preach
sermon.
Sylvia Winters.
You can.
Sylvia Winters can preach. So you can do that. Also, Enrique Dussel, these thinkers who are formed in the crucible of the liberation movement, you bring them into conversation with these communities. Talk to us a bit about that intellectual movement, why it was necessary to move to decolonial theory, to really articulate this theological imagination.
Well, I'm going to have to talk about liberation theology first then, because that's what I was formed in, was Latin American liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez all the way, John Sobrino, kind of the classic texts in Latin American liberation theology. And the way that method works is to understand what's going on in the world, reflect on it critically, and offer, movement towards some kind of action for transformation, for liberation, etc. And there's always in liberation theology an interlocutor, like an intellectual interlocutor. And so early liberation theology entered into conversation with dependency theory, or Marxism, some sociology, a little bit of literature, but it had these interlocutors. So it kind of it legitimized having non-theological interlocutors and the same thing with liberation theologies in the United States. We have non-theological interlocutors, right? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Everything. We can have these interlocutors. Well, interlocutors change over time and come and go in the trends of the theological academy. And critiques can be made of the early interlocutors. They're still relevant today. But the conversation has shifted in the theological academy from Marxism and dependency theory in the late 20th century to now, the world in which we live, dependency theory kind of gets at this too, the world in which we live is still structured by the historical impact of colonialism. And it's not a historical impact, it's a present impact. It still happens. It's still happening today. It's still the way that the world is structured. The lines of power are still centered in Europe and in Euro-America, and those places and peoples who were colonized are still the places and peoples where the disinherited of the earth are concentrated, right? The lines of power are still there, which is what decolonial scholars call coloniality. That the world is still colonial, basically, right? And so we turn now in liberation theology to have a new interlocutor. What can we learn from this new interlocutor, which is really, as Marxism was, suspicious of Christianity because it's the colonial religion. Is it even possible to have a liberating theology or a decolonial theology is what folks like Walter Mignolo are asking. Is it even possible? Because it's so deeply mired in that colonial tradition. And so we decided that having experienced and lived amongst the ecclesial-based communities and reading this new interlocutor, we could see clear links, not so much between what the liberation theologians were writing 40, 50 years ago, but with what the communities are doing or have been doing for those 50 years. So we don't want to argue that liberation theology is decolonial. We're arguing that what the base communities, what the Church of Los y las Pobres is doing on the ground at the grassroots level is decolonizing Christian faith, Roman Catholicism, and so forth. Does that answer your question?
So their practice is not only in their rituals and their traditions and in their ideas, but you also make note of their art. Mm-hmm. The way in which they unleash the imagination. That this decolonial praxis, in order to decenter those dominant epistemes and those dominant practices, but more importantly to give life to those ecclesial-based communities in ways in which They are animated in another world. In your text, you pay close attention to art. Talk to us about the role of art, music, and expanding this theological imagination.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, it is clear, it's articulated explicitly in this book, but then it plays a role as well here, and you can see on the covers that it's really important to the work. So in decolonial scholarship, the idea is that the world is structured in its ways of producing knowledge, naming being, and enacting power in colonial ways, right? So what decoloniality does is to resist and to challenge colonial knowledge, being, and power. Challenge it and enact and embody alternatives, decolonial alternatives in which many possible worlds can coexist. So knowledge is all about epistemology. How do we know what we know and how do we produce knowledge? Who can do that? Who has the authority? You know, who's sanctioned? Who's legitimate to produce knowledge? That's one thing. Being is where this realm of art and creativity comes into play. Being is, so think about when the European conquest and colonization and enslavement took place 500 years ago, and continues on this trajectory for 5 centuries. As this is happening in the beginning, what is being replaced is not just who gets to know things, but who gets to actually exist as a human being. Who gets to affirm their essence and their humanity in the world in the ways that their people have developed and nurtured and cultivated for generations and generations. Who gets to do that? The European colonizers and missionaries come and say, we're the ones who define being, and you're out entirely unless you adhere to or assimilate to the way in which we envision and imagine, the imagination is at work here, being, and what it means to exist in this world. And so theology is a part of this, but even more so, like liturgy, aesthetics, forms of art and creativity that are imposed on peoples. And the communities that this is being imposed on are being forced to, but this doesn't succeed entirely, right? Because people resist, are being forced to wipe their slate clean of all that beauty and richness of culture and cosmovision and spirituality, art, architecture, music, bordado. This is embroidery, like just everything. That's why I wore this shirt. It was a gift from friends in El Salvador to say this was attempted to be kind of washed away, so that these empty vessels could be filled with Western European Christianity and civilization, right? And so resistance isn't just taking back epistemology and knowledge as a form of subjectivity, and it's not just taking back power and authority as a form of subjectivity. It's about existing in forms of beauty and relationship and relationality with the world around us, with one another, with the ecosystems, that expresses this particular world in the way it shows up, right? That isn't simply assimilating to the worldview and the understanding of beauty that is imposed by another. It's a resurgence from below of what it means to be human in really beautiful ways. And so art is infused throughout both texts. And in this, the Remembering book, we talk about, we theorize it. In this other book, it's there.
In their lives and in their witness.
In the witness, right? And in the way that eco-martyrs are remembered. So iconography, music, visual art, textiles, cooking. I mean, there's a long list that we could just go on and on of ways in which this shows up for folks in the ecclesial-based communities and across Latin America in memory of the eco-martyrs. So you have there 2 handouts that I had where you can see, those are the images from the cover. So the first cover was elaborated, my co-author and I approached someone she worked with in the organization that we both had worked with, but I much long before her. This is a younger guy who I didn't know when I lived there. This is called the Common Table, La Mesa Común. And you could just stare at it for hours and find more and more meaning in it. And so we invited him, Alex is his name, and he's a phenomenal artist who now has a piece of artwork on the front of the Latin American agenda, which is it's an agenda, it's basically a calendar, right? But it's also a work of resistance because it's got artwork and essays and poetry and the list of martyrs for every day. He's got a piece on the front of that for 2024. So we asked him to do something that depicted what is sung in the song on the back of that sheet. It's called Vamos Todos al Banquete is the song, and it's from the Salvador Popular Mass, and it's let's all go to the banquet, to the table of creation. So that table in which we're all welcome. There's so much more to this image we could talk about all night. But this is what we asked. We asked him, can you just depict this visually? And then I knew for this book I would need his work as well. And you can see on this book, artistically depicted the work of land and environmental defenders in Ecomartyrdom, Ecomartyrdom, Voice of the Earth, Fuerza de Vida, like the force of life, kind of like a life force. And on the back of that one is the song of resistance. It's called A la Chingada. Perdón para los que hablan español. It doesn't translate directly as go to hell. It translates probably directly more ugly than that. But also funny, it's kind of like they see this song, one of the members of the base community wrote this as a protest against a company that wanted to come and build a dam. It was like, no. Can also be translated like F off, F you, all kinds of things. I'm a good Catholic girl, I don't say those words. But that kind of humor, too, is part of that decolonial being, creativity that we're talking about. So you can take those with you, study them further, the beautiful iconography of them.
Well, Liz, we've asked you a number of questions, and the conversation could, as you correctly stated, continue to go on. But we want to open it up for a few questions from our audience. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please do so now. I have plenty more, don't worry about that. This is not that famous movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where we say anyone. But if you have any questions about the conversation tonight or that sparked your imagination, please share.
Sure, I'll ask one. I would like to hear a little more about staying home. I'd like to hear a little more about the relationship between the institutional church and the communities themselves. And it sounds that your comment about the institutional church it basically said our doors are shut to you. Mm-hmm. And particularly in Catholic Church, which has historically is very hierarchical, of course. It's very hierarchical.
Yeah.
And I was sort of struck by your association with how the growth areas for churches have been in the evangelical, on the evangelical side. And it seemed like those two trends would be related in some way. But I was curious if you could say a little more about that.
Ooh. Yeah, so I can say a good bit more about the process that led to the base communities being pushed out of the institutional church. A little less about the move, that kind of surge in Pentecostal and evangelicalism. But so Archbishop Oscar Romero loved the base communities. One of the first lines I think of the book is his line where how could I not be filled with joy at the fact that there are these flourishing ecclesial-based communities? This was part of the reforms of the church, and he was thrilled that the people of God were taking up, the mantle of being the active agents of the gospel and the reign of God. And when he was killed, there was a supportive archbishop who replaced him, but he wasn't as vocal and wasn't as public, of a figure. The war was just ravaging communities, right? So in the 90s, after the peace accords, and the 2000s, a series of very conservative and Opus Dei archbishop was appointed to the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was a general, like an honorary general in the army, and this is after a civil war in which the army was massacring villages, entire people, communities, and there was a move within the Catholic Church at large to walk back the reforms of the Second Vatican Council and to walk back in Latin America this empowerment of the laity. And that's largely, there are wonderful things that John Paul II did, and Joseph Ratzinger, who was under John Paul, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then became Pope Benedict XVI when John Paul II passed away. But they were afraid of liberation theology. They were afraid of this kind of empowerment of the laity. And so bishops were appointed, priests were formed, and there was just this move away from that line of thinking and acting in the church. And so the base communities more and more were pushed out. In El Salvador, in a lot of other places as well, but especially El Salvador, there was something about this reactionary movement in this place that had so many powerful martyrs and communities at work, that get to a point in the early 2000s where parishes are like really truly turning people away and saying, you can't do that kind of work here. If you want to be Catholic, you have to focus on these songs, this way of reading the Bible, this way of thinking about spirituality and the afterlife and that kind of thing. So this is kind of a long trajectory of a reactionary movement that goes back all the way to the 60s and 70s, but really gains traction later in the 20th century and into the 2000s. And meanwhile, 94% of El Salvador had been Catholic before the war in the 70s, and now it's about 50% evangelical, I think. And I think people are drawn to evangelicalism because of the powerful potential it has to really help people heal from trauma, and Pentecostalism as well, kind of that ritualistic way of worshiping and communing with God. That's really powerful, and I think it's something that's missing from liberation theology or ecclesial-based communities. So you can see why the attraction is there, and that's a powerful pull, especially when you're being told you know nothing, you're the laity. Okay, well here I can actually, have a conversation and be taken seriously in these other spaces. Yeah.
I want to also.
This really does bring up this question of the role of the Bible in ecclesial-based communities, and I want to give a shout out to BIB 614.
Thank you, BIB 614, for being here.
Multicultural biblical interpretation. I think I'm curious about the role of the Bible in these ecclesial-based communities, precisely because it seems like one of the trade-offs that can be made when one challenges the hierarchy of the church and then moves to the biblical dominance of evangelical communities, particularly when we've got a biblical text that we know has colonial overtones, that is colonial in and of itself, I would say. What's that trade-off about, and where is the empowerment coming, I guess?
Mm-hmm. So when folks began to read the Bible in biblical circles in the wake of Vatican II, they weren't reading the Bible as a colonial text. They were reading it as a text that they, as colonized and oppressed peoples, identified with people in the story. So they identified with the the story of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. They read that story and said, hey, that sounds familiar. That's us. Oh, what does God want for us? Does God want us to stay poor and enslaved to the system? No. God wants us to be liberated, right? Mary, the mother of Jesus, a poor, unwed mother under empire. They're reading Mary in the biblical circle and the Magnificat as a text that they can identify with in the biblical circles. And so it's not a move, it's a move towards identification in the biblical text with those who are oppressed and finding liberation in whatever way that comes, in whatever story that happens. So they're identifying with Jesus as an hacelo todo. It's like a jack of all trades, or like the guy from Nazareth, where nothing good comes from Nazareth. So the method of biblical interpretation for those in BIB 614 is one of identification with, of seeing the text as a mirror to the reality that is being lived. Does that help? And so it's very different from just, we have a Bible study, and let's just talk about how this applies to our personal spirituality or our daily lives or relationship with our families. It's how do we identify the structures of power that are at work in the Bible and see them at work today still in this colonial situation under empire.
Nice.
So one of our questions that we came up with in class this summer
was around the idea of the eschaton and justice, and is it possible to do the people in El Salvador that you met, how do they view complete justice? Is it possible in the now? Is there a firm look on the future? Where is that divide for these communities, especially when they are going up against such strong power structures, whether it's in the farming industry or the church or what have you?
I don't think that's really a question I can answer because part of what's really beautiful about the communities is that they're dialogical and there's not a position on anything that anyone takes officially. So there's no official position on that question, and it's something people would just sit around talking about. What do we think about this question? So I got to go back after a long, long time of not going because of that other full-time job that I had. And I went back last November and we sat around and we discussed one of the passages that refers to resurrection. It was one of that weird passage where there's no marriage in heaven kind of thing. What is the resurrection? And it was a circle of people questioning this text and wondering, what does resurrection really mean? Is it something that we experience in the here and now? Is it in the eschaton? It's a dialogical process of seeking and making meaning together that doesn't have a definitive answer to questions of whether there's going to be justice in the afterlife. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that speaks to the decolonialized method is dialogue.
Yeah, which I meant to say when we first opened up earlier, but I jumped right in because of nerves. I am so grateful for this opportunity in general. I'm grateful to Dean Walker just for us doing this, but also I'm really grateful for the format of a conversation because it's true to what we experienced, my co-author and I, in the communities themselves. This is a conversation. It's not an expert with all the knowledge who that delivers it on a paper with a PowerPoint and everything laid out for you with an answer to the question of what's justice in the afterlife, but rather a conversation. I love that.
Continue to explore, examine, and raise questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can continue to go on throughout the evening, but we do have a reception afterwards where the conversation can continue. So I do want to close us off for this moment, put a pause in this conversation, but also invite you to join us for our next Faith Forum on Wednesday, October 25th at 4 p.m. in the Pew Auditorium of the Benson University Center here on the campus of Wake Forest University, where we will welcome Professor Michael Lamb, who holds the F.M. Kirby Foundation Chair of Leadership and Character and is the Executive Director of the Leadership and Character Program, who will discuss his recently published and well-received book, A Commonwealth of Hope, Augustine's Political Thought, recently published by Princeton University Press, and he'll be in conversation with our own Assistant Dean, John Senior. So come join us on Wednesday, October 24th at 4 p.m. But as we close tonight, I've asked Liz to close us tonight with a reading from one of her books of her choosing. And she's chosen a reading from Ecomartyrdom in the Americas, and that will close us off. Liz?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm so grateful again for this opportunity. We can continue the conversation in many, many other venues at Wake Forest and beyond. So what I'm going to read to you is from chapter 4, which is called Narrating the Witness in Memory of Murdered Land and Environmental Defenders, and it's from the introduction to chapter 4, but the rest of chapter 4 tells the stories of 6 murdered land and environmental defenders. And so that's the context for what you're going to hear. You have the bullet, but I have the word. The bullet dies when it is detonated, but the word lives on when it is replicated. This proverb, now scattered across environmental justice spaces on the internet, is attributed to murdered environmental defender Berta Cáceres, and often appears on the posters, banners, websites, and social media presence of environmental defenders who carry on her legacy. The word to which Berta refers here can take on many forms that land and environmental defenders embody every day. Words of protest and denunciation of extractivism and the violence that it entails. Words of hope and healing for indigenous peoples and others whose communities have been fighting for liberation and environmental justice for generations. Words expressing and inspiring the embodiment of an alternative world in which all of our worlds are free to coexist in reciprocal relationships of justice and peace with one another and with our common home. Another form of the word in which murdered environmental defenders live on is in the telling of their stories. Their lives were cut short violently and unjustly in an instant, but their stories live on when we refuse to let their murderers have the last word, when we remember them and refuse to let their witness be silenced. Telling their stories is essential to this task, which is why we now turn in the chapter, you gotta read it if you wanna see that part, which is why we now turn to narratives of several murdered environmental defenders whose stories are treasured and told in their local communities across Latin America and even around the world. In the Catholic tradition, saints and martyrs are commemorated by telling their stories. To be sure, they are remembered in feast day celebrations and processions and veneration of their relics, statues, and other material culture, in pilgrimages to sites of sacred significance. But they're also remembered in the telling of their stories. Telling the stories of saints and martyrs is often called hagiography, literally writing about that which is holy. In the history of the tradition, these narratives often take the form of legend, based more in oral tradition than historically verifiable fact. Furthermore, hagiography rarely takes note of the human failings of a given figure, unless those failings took place prior to a conversion or transformation of some kind. In modern hagiography, whether religious or secular, we rely more on historical records and written reports than on oral traditions, but the holiness of a figure remains the focus of the narrative, stressing the ways in which their life and or death bears witness to a given sacred quality of faith, beauty, justice, mercy, or love. Hagiography can thus reveal as much about the community of memory as it does about the remembered individual. As a political scientist, Maria Jose Mendez puts it, who are the figures that guide the way we live, relate, think, and write? From where do we draw our strength? And what do these sources of inspiration say about the worlds we want to dismantle and those we seek to build? The figures we cite and honor matter as they reveal much about these worlds. End of quote. Telling the sacred stories of our sources of inspiration can run the risk of idealizing or romanticizing real human beings who had real human failings, who struggled with very difficult choices in the midst of conflictual and ambiguous historical circumstances. At the same time, there's a clarity of vision presented in hagiography that can empower communities of memory in their identity formation, in their resistance to injustice and evil, in their articulation and embodiment of an alternative moral imagination, and in their communal power to act with love and justice in the face of violence and oppression. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all very much.